Good evening and welcome to Economics Unbound. I'm Nastasia Arendse, standing in for Tandega Kubulembeki. Tonight we tackle something interesting, a form of transportation that makes a big difference within the South African economy. There are a number of reasons why exports and imports are important. Last year in October, President Cyril Ramaphosa outlined the economic reconstruction and recovery plan for South Africa. He plans to place the economy on a new trajectory to support massive growth in local production and make South African exports much more competitive.
Good evening. We're still looking on the significance of exports and imports in the South African economy, right? While, according to trade and industrial policy strategies, exporting breaks the constraints of the domestic markets, allows the firms to expand, specialize, and enjoy economies of scale. Exporting generates foreign currency, which is then used to finance imports and uncovered costs incurred entering new export markets. We take a look at President Cyril Ramaphosa's visit to the port of Durban on Thursday. He says enhancing the effectiveness and performance of the country's ports is crucial in helping South Africa's sluggish economy to recover and grow. He also said measures were put in place to ensure that all problems being experienced were being addressed.
The export market offers an opportunity for South African firms to grow beyond the limitations of the local market and employ more people. Exporting encourages innovation through international competition and leads to improved product quality. Most countries that have achieved rapid and sustainable high levels of economic growth over the past decade have achieved that through exporting. South African President Cyril Ramaphosa outlined the country's economic recovery plan in October last year, where he mentioned that if 10% of South Africans exports, or rather imported goods, excluding oil, could be manufactured locally, the country would add 2% to its GDP.
We've had a wonderful visit to the port. I walk away from my visit here at Durban Port extremely encouraged, elated, and the aspirations that and the plans and the vision that we've put out as a country fits in very well. Durban Port is a national asset. It is the most important port in the economic architecture of our country, and we want Durban Port to function. When Durban Port does not function, it has a negative impact on trade and commerce in the whole nation, and it is therefore important that it should. So we're very pleased that the management has it in hand, and all that remains now is implementation. And the chairman of the board, Mr. Ramabulana, told me that they are going to implement. This is an implementable plan. They know, the executives know, led by Portia Dabi, they know exactly what needs to be done to implement this plan, working together with the province and with the city, the metro. They know exactly where it's going to go, and it's going to have wonderful areas, entertainment areas, and allowing people to be able to come, and this is a dream in the making. It's going to be a really success story, and we're very pleased with the way it is going forward.
The president also said that public enterprises and transport departments are working to implement structural reforms that will modernize and increase investment in the transport sector. Transnet would form private partnerships with other businesses. He also added that intensive work is being undertaken to determine the most appropriate way forward for corporatization of the National Ports Authority, as well as to introduce greater private sector participation and investment in port infrastructure.
President Cyril Ramaphosa visited the port of Durban last week, Thursday, to assess progress made in infrastructure improvement following his meeting with port users and stakeholders in October last year. They complained about the congestion at the port and the very delayed turnaround on goods received at the port. Improving the performance of South Africa's ports, particularly off the Durban port, is central to government's objective of maintaining South Africa's position amongst the largest and efficient trading ports. Meanwhile, Satawu staged a demonstration accusing government and Transnet of planning to privatize the port.
The Port of Durban, known as Africa's most active general cargo port, handling about 4,500 vessels a year. President Cyril Ramaphosa, Transport Minister Fikile Mbalula and Minister of Public Enterprises Pravin Gordhan were in the port to access its efficiency. This after reports of heavy congestion that have been delaying cargo clearing. But despite these challenges, the President says the Port of Durban is vital for the country's economy.
Durban Port is a national asset. It is the most important port in the economic architecture of our country, and we want Durban Port to function. When Durban Port does not function, it has a negative impact on trade and commerce in the whole nation, and it is therefore important that it should. So we're very pleased that the management has it in hand, and all that remains now is implementation.
The President's visit was met with pickets from members of the South African Transport and Allied Workers Union, SATAU. They are aggrieved by an unverified document stating that the port will be privatized. They say the move could result in thousands of job losses.
The first thing that we want to send a message to the president of the country that he is the president of the workers. The workers are worried that this port is going to be privatized, and we know history have taught us that when privatization is taking place, it opens for a corruption, and workers cannot be affected with that.
But President Ramaphosa dispelled these allegations as he sought to allay organized labor's fears.
We're not privatizing Transnet. We are going to be proceeding with what we have already said, that a number of other investments are so big that they require partners to be brought on board. Transnet is a state-owned enterprise. We're not privatizing it. Transnet will continue to bring in partners and work with them.
During this year's State of the Nation address, the President announced plans to develop Ngqura as the container terminal of choice. But today, he urged Durban Port officials to continue deliberating on the proposed plans to move Transnet's head office to the Eastern Cape.
We are going to have an opportunity again to sit with our colleagues, they're part of us, and understand where the anxiety is coming from, and we'll deal with those issues.
The President says Transnet National Port Authority has already made substantial progress in addressing concerns from the private sector. Jade Lee-Paulser, SABC News, Durban.
Well, joining me on Zoom is Professor Yanni Rousseau, who's the head of school at the Economic and Business Sciences Division within the University of the Witwatersrand. Prof, thank you so much for your time this evening.
Good evening, Nastasia, and good evening to our viewers.
I mean, let's put on your economics hat here as an economist for a bit, and perhaps you can school us a little bit on the importance of ports and why it is that, they facilitate such important, call it trade and various other important aspects.
Well, South Africa must position itself as the gateway into Southern Africa in terms of trade, and for that to happen, we need functioning ports. Now, what concerns me is why has the deterioration at Durban Port been allowed in the first instance? It was a world-class port before. Currently, it's not functioning that well. And why has this deterioration taken place? We need to understand that before we start talking about rebuilding the Port of Durban into a world-class port again. But I do agree with our president that we need world-class ports in South Africa. At the same time, we also need world-class border posts for trade out of South Africa to the rest of Southern Africa.
Prof, I'm sure you saw the article, a couple of months ago where we had the vessel that was stuck at the Suez Canal in Egypt and the kind of implications it had on global supply chains. And it got me thinking at the time how important it is to have these functioning ports because it has these ripple effects. Let's talk back about COVID-19. I mean, we saw global disruptions, and perhaps you could talk to us about the impact that may have had on supply chains.
Yes, COVID-19 had supply chain disruptions. It also resulted in less international trade, which was a wonderful opportunity for South Africa to focus on things like getting its ports infrastructure in order. Likewise, we had the ban on international travel, which was an excellent opportunity to sort out administration at our border posts. I can only hope that the government used this opportunity to remove these bottlenecks. The Suez Canal incident clearly showed the importance of the sea route around Cape Town. But then we as South Africa have a responsibility to make it attractive for international trade to visit our ports and to pass around the southern tip of Africa.
If we were to get that right, I mean, I was reading the president's economic recovery plan, and one of the points, when it comes to the structural reforms that the plan intends to implement, and I quote here, it says, reorienting trade policies and pursuing greater regional integration to boost exports, employment and innovation. If we do fix the Durban port, we get everything working, how do we then get to the next step of that regional integration, boosting exports, and then, of course, employment and innovation follow suit?
Yeah, as I've said, we need to get our border posts sorted out. And then, of course, we need to integrate with the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement, which will give us the opportunity of free trade into Africa. I'm not sure which plan you refer to. The government has had many plans. I've just looked at the Operation Vulindlela plan, for instance, and already we see slippage on that plan. So if there's a price for plans, this government will get it. But with all these plans, we lack implementation. For instance, we've already had slippage on Operation Vulindlela plan. The spectrum auction should have been in March 2021 in terms of the plan. March has come and gone. There's no plan for spectrum auction on the table. So we see slippage with these plans. The government is very good in planning, but is hopeless in implementation. So all these promises are made. I will get excited when we see implementation.
So does that mean that you're slightly skeptical on the plan to get the Durban port in well-functioning order?
No. I never said I'm slightly skeptical. I'm very skeptical. If I was only slightly skeptical, I would have felt better. The president has spoken and nothing will happen. This is the story of South Africa. I will be less skeptical when I see action following on what the president has said. So I'm very skeptical about what the president said. I'm not only slightly skeptical. The president makes these promises and nothing happens because this government has lost its ability to implement anything, whether it's fixing sewage running in the streets at municipal level, or whether it is fixing state-owned enterprises, or whether it's fixing ports. The government has lost its ability to implement whatever it plans.
You were talking about the African Free Continental Trade Agreement, and I can imagine probably one or two questions people were asking at the time that it was, taking off, was that why are we implementing such a plan when the world is moving towards protectionist and isolationist policies? And I mean, how do you answer that question as an economist?
There's very little intra-regional and intra-continental trade in Africa. Africa trades with countries outside the continent, whereas it will be much easier and cheaper to trade with neighboring countries, immediately neighboring countries and in the region. It's much easier, it's much cheaper if we can get the bottlenecks out of the way. It will be beneficial to all the people in Africa if we can trade cheaper, we can have cheaper supply of goods and services. It will help to eradicate poverty and it will help to create employment. The problem, however, is South Africa sits here in the south, and if we don't get our house in order, the Continental Free Trade Agreement, the implementation will move ahead without South Africa, and we will be left behind. As it is, South Africa has one of the lowest economic growth rates on the continent over the past decade. The continent is leaving South Africa behind.
Yeah. I mean, from your numbers and, the models that you may be looking at and the various stats that are out there, I mean, when you look at South Africa's economy, getting to those pre-COVID levels, never mind, reaching some of these ambitious growth targets that some institutions have for the country, how do we get there and how long does it take for us to get there?
The current indication is that it will take about 3 years to get the economy back to the level where we were at the end of 2019 before COVID in 2020. The problem, however, is that South Africa has had a decade of very low economic growth. On average, over the past decade, economic growth was lower than population growth in South Africa, implying that we all get poorer. And current indications are, in terms of the growth projections, that it will take 3 years to wipe out the negative growth, or call it the economic collapse, of last year. And our challenge in South Africa is to restore a higher growth path going forward. And to do that, the government must simply implement the good plans that had been developed.
Right, so you mentioned 2019, and that got me thinking in terms of some of the big headlines at the time. And when we were talking US-China relations, we were talking Brexit and various other things. And then suddenly 2020 came in and the ball game changed in terms of what the risk factors were for the global economy. Let's bring China into the conversation when we're talking the African Free Trade Continental Agreement. I mean, if we're trying to promote intra-African trade and, producing goods made in Africa and moving them amongst each other, does that mean that the relationship we have with China from a trade perspective would have to change?
Stimulating intra-African trade is not to the exclusion of other trade relations. It's not that you have either African trade relations or trade relations with the rest of the world. You can have both, which would be beneficial to South Africa. China is our most important trading partner and will remain our most important trading partner for many years to come. But to have more trade with Africa and more efficient trade with Africa is not to the exclusion of trade with China.
Right. I mean, we were talking about the Durban port and getting some of those structural issues fixed. But when you look at the ports and the movement of goods within Africa, while we're talking about the African Free Trade Continental Agreement, how do we fix those blockages? Because we can have many plans as South Africa, as you've mentioned, but I can imagine some of the leaders within some of the countries where, ports are moving through, goods are moving through. How do we get that regional integration and having seamless customs, seamless, administration when we're moving goods across?
Well, for a start, we have to look at our own border posts. South Africa must lead by example, and only once we have everything in place, we can start talking to countries to the north of us to see whether there are capacity constraints or skills constraints where South Africa can offer them help. But we can't offer them help while we have chaos at Beit Bridge. They will not take us seriously. Or while we have chaos at the border post at Komatipoort. They will not take us seriously because we are not setting a good example. South Africa must lead by example, by doing the things right and then engaging the other countries to say, we can offer you this example. Are you prepared to work with us?
Well, on that note, thank you so much for your time, Professor Jannie Rousseau. Of course, that is Professor Jannie Rousseau from the Wits School of Business, talking to us about his views on fixing the Durban port and various other issues across the African continent, and talking to us about how we can make things a little bit better. We're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we continue the conversation.
South Africa has struggled to increase its exports, despite an improvement in the economic activity of its trading partners. South Africa's exports grew by 0.9% per annum between 2010 and 2013. South African export growth has been poor relative to comparable countries. According to the World Bank, if South Africa's exports had grown as fast as the middle-income country average over the period between 2010 and 2013, exports would now be 2.5 times larger than currently. President Cyril Ramaphosa says Transnet will spend 100 billion rands to modernize the port of Durban. The 11-year plan is estimated to create 180,000 jobs.
Trade in 2020 was impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. This not only changed imported quantities for products that South African imports on a regular basis, such as crude oil and automotive components. It also changed the composition of imported products, with shifts to products needed to fight the pandemic. So according to research from Trade and Industrial Policy Strategies, South Africa saw its trade surplus surge to 109 billion rand for the first time in the past decade, although it declined to 103 billion rand in the fourth quarter of 2020. The impact of COVID-19 on South Africa began seriously in the second quarter of the year, following the implementation of a hard lockdown at the end of the first quarter of the year. Second quarter trade became the lowest since the second quarter of 2020, with imports falling by 26% and exports falling by 18% in the second quarter of 2020. During that same quarter, imports of textiles, materials, medicines, and medical instruments, as well as paper and paperboard largely used in packaging, saw significant increases. Government is working hard to help the Durban port reclaim its place as the best performing port in Africa. That's according to President Cyril Ramaphosa in his weekly letter. He visited the Durban harbour last week to monitor the operational improvements and infrastructure reforms. For years now, local businesses have been complaining about inefficiencies at the harbour. Shipping companies had expressed concern about truck congestion and waiting times, poor maintenance of equipment, and generally low productivity at the port. But now President Cyril Ramaphosa says the truck turnover times have greatly improved, with ship waiting times reduced to impressive levels. The president also says the reliability of cargo handling equipment is also impressive at 80%, and soon will reach the same % to meet international benchmark. He says reforms at the port will not lower costs of doing businesses and improve competitiveness, but will create thousands of much-needed jobs in the country. More insights and discussions from my colleague Nastasia Aronsa.
Therefore, trade policies need to create an environment which supports current as well as future potential large exporters in order to increase export growth and diversification. South Africa's exports are currently growing very slowly, and projections are for continued slow to moderate growth. Most of our trading partners, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, our main market for manufacturing exports, are growing far more rapidly. Given the structure of the South African economy, growth in manufacturing will also require improved performance in the export market. To unpack this, we're joined by economist and researcher at the Trade and Industrial Policy Strategies, Nokwanda Maseko. Nokwanda, thank you so much for your time this evening.
Thank you so much for having me.
So what does the trade landscape look like for South Africa, especially given where we've come from with the pandemic in the background?
So at the moment, I mean, if you look at fourth quarter trade, you can see that our trade surplus is beginning to go down. So in the fourth quarter, for example, the trade surplus is 103 billion compared to about 109 billion in the third quarter. And you see that because mostly imports are beginning to improve. So we're getting more goods into the country. We are still having high exports, but if you look at our export range, it's mostly natural resources, and the stuff that we're getting in is mostly manufactured goods.
In terms of that, then the opposite, when we look at import, what range are we looking at in terms of products?
So what we're looking at in terms of products, it's mostly manufactured capital equipment as well as consumer goods, for example. But I think the biggest change that we've seen so far has been a big impact on our imports of crude oil, and that's been largely the result of decreased production. I mean, the production is beginning to pick up at the moment, so you can see that as well in terms of our imports. But overall, you see some products are still down. We haven't fully recovered in terms of manufactured imports of automotives and components, for example. We still haven't really recovered in terms of machinery. We haven't fully recovered, but we are actually getting there.
On that note then, a little bit earlier on, we had Professor Yanni Rousseau. We touched a little bit on supply chains, being affected by the pandemic. But the other topic that we did touch a little bit on was the vessel that was stuck, the Suez Canal that was lodged between there. But when you look at the data within your organization and the stats, how has supply chains changed over the past year as a result of the pandemic?
So we've seen a very big disruption in terms of our inputs in particular. So if you look at the year-on-year data, for example, beginning in 2019, you see that our imports are still down, and largely that's because of low crude oil imports because of just the decrease in the price of crude oil, but also the overall quantities are down. And if you look at our exports, you see that we've increased our exports. But I think the concerning thing is that even though we've increased our exports, that's mostly exports of natural resources that are not beneficiated. And so we're not really reaping the full rewards of being able to mine the product and manufacturing something out of them and then sending them out to other countries, for example. And as a result, the South African economy has not really been able to fully reap those rewards in terms of employment, in terms of economic growth, in terms of just overall opportunities.
How has China reacted in terms of, this new shift in supply chains, and have they managed to get their import-exports under control as we try to inoculate more people as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic?
So generally, since the second quarter, which is when we started seeing the low imports in South Africa, China was at that point actually doing quite well. So we see that even though amongst our major trade partners, there was a decline in imports, for example, even exports at that point in the second quarter, we start to see at that point that China is actually increasing their imports to South Africa. Well, we're increasing the imports that we get from China. And that really has been the result of their being able to then recover from the pandemic quite soon. And I suppose they did have an advantage in the sense that they experienced most of the impacts of the pandemic quite early on in the year, so around the first quarter, for example. But South Africa and its major trade partners, such as Germany, for example, we're still trying to recover. So if you look at trade in the fourth quarter, you see that actually our imports and exports to major trade partners, such as Germany and the US, are still relatively down if you compare them to the previous year. But overall, I would say that if you look at the fourth quarter data, for example, you see that South Africa is showing some improvement, and that is in the form of how much we're importing. And I mean, we do tend to look at imports as a thing that's not really good for our economy. But if you consider the fact that some of the things that we actually import are capital goods that go into the manufacture of other goods, then you see that we need imports. So there's generally been an improvement. So if you look at fourth quarter data, that's when you start to see that actually imports are starting to pick up. And if I remember correctly, I think fourth quarter imports were just over 300 billion. There's still some continued exports, and that really has largely been driven by gold exports. So it's not to say that we've started manufacturing certain products and therefore we're exporting them. It's still unbeneficiated natural resources, which really, as I said earlier, does not really do that much for the economy. Yes, it's good, but if we're not beneficiating, then we're not creating the jobs that we need.
Well, one of the reasons you and I are having this conversation is because it was inspired by President Cyril Ramaphosa visiting the Durban port after a number of issues were highlighted at the time. But when we look at the port, I mean, that is, an important port, but how does it relate to, rail and movement of goods using airport? How do those things work hand in hand, especially when it comes to infrastructure capacity right now?
So if you look at the letter that the president sent out, you see that some of the issues are actually properly outlined. So if you start to think about if there's inefficiencies at the port and if goods are not moving in or out as quickly as they need to be, that begins to cost the consumer at the end of the day. So what you then need to think about is the fact that if we have a properly running port, if we have a properly running infrastructure system, then we're able to move goods in and out quickly, which reduces the cost to consumers. But I think the other argument that can be made is the fact that if, considering how far South Africa is from some of the major trade partners, you do actually need to have properly running infrastructure, because otherwise major trade partners can simply go, for example, to Morocco, to Egypt, as you see in the president's letter. And once you start thinking about that, then you get into the fact that if we don't fix those issues, then we're going to start losing some of the markets. So if you look at, for example, Morocco, as was mentioned in the president's letter, that's one of the countries, along with Egypt, along with Ghana, that are now moving into automotive manufacturing, for example. So if we continue experiencing inefficiencies, chances are you then have major automotive manufacturers, for example, such as Toyota, such as BMW, then deciding, you know what, we can actually do this at a much cheaper price and do it quickly if we're using infrastructure outside of the country. But even outside of those companies benefiting, the benefits for an efficiently run port and efficiently run transportation infrastructure actually go back to, well, hopefully go back to consumers in the sense of lower prices.
As an economist, do you have a view on governments managing ports, or should it be something that the private sector does, or can they work hand in hand?
I mean, at the point that I'm at right now, I do think that there needs to be collaboration. I do think that we can't always rely on the private sector to do all of this work, but at the same time, it can't be a thing that we put on the state. So then it needs to be a collaboration, because I think government as or the state overall has a bigger view of what's happening with its citizens, and theoretically, the state is supposed to know what citizens need, what infrastructure is needed, and private sector has then the capital to actually go in and do the work. And at the end of the day, mostly the private sector is the one that's benefiting from properly run infrastructure, properly run logistics hubs, for example. So I do think that it needs to be a collaboration between the state and the private sector.
Well, Nokwanda, let's leave it there. Thank you so much for your time. That is Nokwanda Maseko, who is an economist at the Trade and Industrial Policy Strategy. We're going to take a short break and we'll continue the conversation.
Despite the fact that only 21% of South Africa's workforce have some post-secondary education, South Africa's manufacturing exports are more sophisticated than almost all of its peer countries. According to the World Bank, South African exports have been shifting increasingly towards medium and high technology sectors, increasing the demand for high-skilled labor and enhancing capital intensity. This has a positive implication for South African export competitiveness, but underutilizing the large pool of low-skilled labor in the country.
Well, joining me to have this conversation and taking it a little bit further, we're joined by Alan Mukoki, who's the Chief Executive at the South African Chamber of Commerce and Industry. Alan, thank you so much for joining us while we have this conversation. From the conversations you've had in the past and the data you may have read, where are the issues when we look at South Africa's export competitiveness?
Well, I think that the first thing that needs to happen is that we need to have what I would refer to as a strategic comparative advantage. You know, there are so many people manufacturing so many things out there. I mean, we've come from the point where we make this very interesting or clear observation. For South Africa to resolve its big three issues in the area of poverty, unemployment, inequality, it is for South Africa to drive very strongly its Human Development Index. And what do you mean by that? Raise the level of capacity in respect of your human capital. Because when you've done that, you stand a better chance of developing those competencies and those skills that will then enable you to be in a better position to articulate your position around what exactly is this that you want to compete in. In the last 100 years, only less than 8 countries have moved from developing to developed economies. And amongst those particular countries, you count Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, Singapore, Old Hong Kong, Israel, Russia, and Australia, because those are the countries that are not dissimilar to us as South Africa. And what did they actually do to be able to drive that? Because if you want to solve that problem of unemployment, inequality, and joblessness, growth is going to be at the center of that. So export as a market becomes a very strong fundamental issue, especially for us as South Africans in the context of Africa. So what's stopping us is that we do not have the competencies, we do not have the skills, we cannot articulate very clearly what exactly is this that is our strategic comparative advantage as a nation. What are we good at? Are we good at processing steel? Are we good at beneficiating our minerals? Are we good at platinum groups? Are we good at auto? We have not figured ourselves very clearly in respect of that particular strategy, what we need to do. And therefore, we need to drive the level of skills that are going to be necessary so that we can drive the level of innovation that is required.
On that note then, because you now get me thinking about the African Free Trade Continental Agreement, which we spoke about with Professor Yana Rousseau from Wits Business School, how do you then see it unfolding, especially as you mentioned some of these issues? Because now it brings to mind what other problems that the other countries may have, which may be similar to ours as well. How do we then move it to a seamless agreement so we can achieve what it is it's intended for?
The agreement can be done. The agreement is going to be done. It's being done by the bureaucrats, but the agreement is not going to make any sense if business or entrepreneurship or the people who can deploy the level of capital, the innovation, the machinery, and build projects are not following suit. Right. So there's a gap in South Africa. There's what I refer to as a big lacuna. Sometimes it's a lot more easier for us as people in the private sector to be very critical of the public sector, that there are no skills in the public sector, that we lack the level of leadership that we require. However, truth be told, South African private sector itself has a very big gap when it comes to leadership competencies, especially the one that is required for us as a nation to be able to take advantage of global opportunities, and especially Africa. There is still a lot of Afro-pessimism. There is still a lot of ignorance, because our main institutions of learning, whether it's the big universities or other institutions, there are very few of them where you can go today where you can say there is a strong, very, very, very strong, well-staffed Africa Studies department at any of the big universities in South Africa today. There isn't a lot of research that is being driven at an intellectual academic theory level where people are focused on Africa as a study, whether from a business school point of view or from any other point of view. Therein starts the problem, because how do you build cities? How do you build nations? You start by building cities that are very focused on what you want to do. Build the best universities in a particular town, and the best universities attract the best people, they attract the best companies, the best healthcare. Immediately, everybody starts to run into that particular kind of a city, and one city at a time, you begin to specialize in particular things. Africa growth opportunities means for us as South Africans, we are more advanced than the other African countries. But our advantage is not necessarily a huge advantage, because what we need to be able to do, we need to be able to sell into an Africa that itself is developing from an infrastructure point of view, from a skills point of view, from a markets point of view, so that we're able to sell goods and services to people who've got rising incomes who themselves are working. There's no point in creating a standard bank in Mozambique if you're only going to have something like 500 clients, when you could potentially have something like 15 million clients. So the responsibility to build those economies, to make sure that we drive the capital in the right areas and drive the development by investing in the region, is a very, very critical component of this particular equation. South African business leaders, by their very nature, are not as advanced or innovative in their thinking or as well informed about Africa. They think South Africa is still a piece of Europe lost somewhere in the African continent. So we need to drive the knowledge and the skills, even in the private sector itself, from a leadership point of view, so that when we talk to many of our leaders, they can tell you, Lubumbashi, this is what's happening. A big, nice club in Lubumbashi is at a particular corner. A big golf club in Lubumbashi is at a particular corner. But you can't get that now. If you want to ask them about England, they'll tell you everything that is there in London, from West End to anything else. If you ask them about America, they'll tell you everything about what's happening in New York. But they cannot tell you a thing about what's happening down the road here in Kenya. So we have to take advantage of building the level of skills through our own institutions that are going to not just sensitize, but they're going to educate our own business leaders about the opportunities in Africa, so that they understand deploying money in Africa is good business.
We've just had new leadership being appointed at the World Trade Organization. I mean, how do you see that new leadership with its new strategies and plans affecting Africa at all? Or do you think they'll be dealing with other global issues like this, move to nationalism and protectionism? Or do you think they will actually include some of the African issues?
I don't think that we should look up to the WTO to do anything significant for Africa. We love the leader, the new leader that is there. She's smart. She's very, very experienced. She's highly educated. She's going to the right schools, and I think that she's got the right ideas. But she will need us as business to step up, particularly South Africa, to step up to say we understand our leadership role in the particular continent ourselves. Because that's a point I keep making all the time. You know, Mr. Cyril Ramaphosa was the chairman of the AU for the period that he was. We didn't do anything whatsoever in that particular period in terms of taking advantage, because we're not aligned in terms of our strategies between our African missions as well as business itself. Because we've spent too much time fighting little wars about corruption and about malfeasance and about state capture, and we forgot about running the business itself. So we're not actually investing in the right things in terms of the people, in terms of the leadership, in terms of the infrastructure. We, in the context of the South African Chamber of Commerce, for instance, we talk about for Africa to rise, to go where Africa needs to go, not for the sake of Africa, but for the sake of South Africa opening its own markets and creating value for its own products and services. We need to build the 5 lines of infrastructure, and that is the energy infrastructure around putting the grid lines across all the energy infrastructure levels of generation, transmission, and distribution. We need to build the natural gas lines. As you know, we're under a lot of pressure with all the COP21 or 20-something environmental emissions restrictions that we're facing now. Yet there is sufficient natural gas throughout Africa, but what is missing is the investment in the infrastructure that can bring it. We can power this entire continent cheaper and in a much more greener way by investing and putting in that particular level of infrastructure and natural gas. Then we've got water and sanitation, a very big issue. Then we've got the rail infrastructure that we need, the 10 or the 20 million kilometers of rail for high-speed rail and all these kinds of things that we can do. If these things are not being led from a South African point of view, I will tell you now, it's not going to happen. And therefore, that's why we need to change our mindset here in South Africa. We've got the skills, at least we're a little bit more industrialized than the rest of Africa. We've got a level of experience in terms of consulting, engineering, and a whole range of those particular aspects. And the one thing that is missing is the passion and the enthusiasm and the leadership that is required for us to understand ourselves first as Africans, and then to learn from what these big Southeast Asian countries have actually been able to do. It's Taiwan, it's South Korea, it's Singapore that are driving most of the advancement in all those 10 ASEAN countries where there are almost 750 million people. They're putting in the investment there because they understand for you to grow a Taiwan, for you to grow a South Korea, for you to grow a Singapore, you need to be investing in your own region and driving the value in those markets.
Well, Alan, I've had a fantastic time talking to you, and there's so many aspects of this that we can tease out and discuss even further. However, thank you so much for your time. That is Alan Mokoki, who is the CEO of the South African Chamber of Commerce and Industry. On that note, we've come to the end of the show. It's absolutely been amazing being with you and talking about such a serious topic, imports and exports. So until next time, goodbye from me.